Hi, today I'm going to walk through HubSpot's workflow tool. The workflow tool in HubSpot is a really powerful tool, and it can do a number of different things depending on what your needs are for automation. You'll see here that in this demo portal, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of samples of workflows. So it looks like it is what it is, which is a sandbox. And so it's a little messy. And that's actually the first thing I just want to point out at the top of this demo, which is that it's really a good idea to keep your workflow tool cleaned up and very transparent. And what I mean by transparent is that you have a number of users and potentially new users adopting HubSpot. You'll want to be very clear about your assets in HubSpot and what everything is, because there's a lot going on in here. There's a lot of different assets from email to social media, content, workflow tool, reports, the CRM, so many things that you want to make sure that everything you're doing in HubSpot, you're doing in a way that is clear and aligned and consistent, and basically to keep it organized along the way. And so you'll see here some really good examples of how you can do that. For example, using brackets with caps at the beginning of a workflow name is a really good way to categorize and help people see right away what type of workflow that it is. For example, in a company, we use often admin at the beginning, and that's for internal workflow, something that is just done, perform a task in HubSpot. It's not contact facing. In other words, it's not about emails going out to contacts or anything like that. It's more about something internal that you're wanting to do. And we can get into that a little bit more in a minute. And you can always do things like do not edit if you need to be super careful about making sure that no one touches those things. You don't want anyone messing with the workflow. You can always use those types of labels as well. So just having a plan for how you want to label workflows is a good idea. That said, it's a good idea to understand workflows before you label them so that what your label system needs to look like. Another recommendation I have is to put a description in every single workflow, a very descriptive description. Just be really obvious about what it is. Be really clear about what it is, because again, sometimes you might even be going back to a workflow and forget exactly what you were doing with that workflow or what that workflow was for. It's a really good idea to be very descriptive in the description. Now, it's just you and other users in HubSpot, so it's just your team seeing it. So it doesn't have to be like marketing copy. It just needs to be very descriptive, very obvious, to help out your team and to help yourself remember when you come back and 3 months later and may have forgotten what that workflow is really all about. All right, so with that, let's dive into a few workflows. So there's a few different categories of use for workflows. One of the most obvious ones is contact facing. So that's email follow-ups, for example, or email lead nurturing sequences. So that's anytime you want to follow up with your contacts after something happens, after they take an action or something changes in their contact record, or perhaps they purchase something or give a donation or download something. The possibilities are wide and varied in that situation. But the idea is that you are sending out emails to your contacts through a workflow so that it happens automatically, and it can be a repeatable process that you don't have to keep doing manually or do the work to try to keep up with the type of follow-up that's required marketing and sales. So let's take a look at one. Here's one called, I don't know what's in here yet, so I'm just going to open this up and hope that it has some things in it. And so this is a good example. This one is a perfect example. Someone has filled out a form on your website. In this example, it's very simple, straightforward. HubSpot form has been filled out. So for every contact that fills out the form, they'll get entered into this workflow here. These are the trigger enrollments. So the first thing you're going to set up when you set up a workflow is what triggers this workflow. What happens somewhere in the vast ecosystem of the HubSpot software? What triggers this to happen? What criteria? And so that's what you're going to decide to set up when you set up the trigger enrollments. You're going to be able to build that out. And you can build out layered enrollment criteria as well. It does not have to be one thing. It could be this and then this. This example is a form submission. Somebody fills out a form and then they get an SMS message and then they get an email as well. And there's no time in between these two things. So this is happening in a row. You can add delays in here. Here's a delay right here. After they've sent the initial text and email, they then go to a delay and then they send another email. If we keep going down here, we'll see that eventually this particular workflow branches out. You can add logic branching in your workflows as well. Let's say they've never opened any one of these emails, they did not engage, they're going to get removed from the list. They're going to get put in somewhere else or just simply get removed from this particular list where the organization is trying to engage and further help the contact along their marketing journey. So in this case, removing them from a list is a really great way to make sure your segmentation stays up to date. This is a really good example because it starts out very simple. You could just do one thing in a workflow and call it a day. You're done. You've sent them a text. That's it. It just all depends. So that's an example of a workflow that is going to do something when someone in your contact database does something like fill out a form. It could also be something that changes on their record. It doesn't necessarily have to even be something that they've done, or action that they've taken, clicked on a CTA or filled out a form or made a donation. It could just be that a salesperson changed something on their record, changed something important on their record, perhaps moved them into a different stage of some fundraising journey, in a one-to-one fundraising journey, let's say. So to create a workflow, you start from scratch. There's also templates within HubSpot. There's also AI, which you could use just to tell AI what you want to do, and then it will set up a workflow. That's catch as catch can. You can try it out and see if it works. You most likely may have to do adjustments. It's not perfect, but it could be a good way to just save a little time and get going. For the purposes of this demo, we're just going to start out with building our own from scratch. You're going to see different triggers over here. You could trigger manually. You'll be able to choose the records, but to me, this is all about automation, but you can always have a workflow ready for, let's say, when you just have a few contacts and you just want to control it a bit more and you maybe do one contact at a time or a group of contacts at a time, say for an event or something like that. You could always trigger manually, which means that you'll have to come in here and when you're ready to get that workflow going again, you'll add a set of contacts in and then the workflow will run. But for the automation that you just want to have going on in the background, you're going to use either met filter criteria or on a schedule. So let's look at the one I think is used the most often, which is filter criteria. So there's a lot of different criteria that you can put in here. Basically, it's pretty much everything in all the objects that you have in HubSpot and with most of the properties. Now, there are some exceptions, and I couldn't list those exceptions. That's just something you're going to have to do trial and error. You'll have to do a bit of trial and error to get to exactly what you want to do. This is where you can start exploring. So let's just say I wanted to do a contact property. You're going to see all of those here. So you'll be able to find all different things you could either do under any of the categories in the object. So in this case, it's like the contact information, or if I keep scrolling, I'll find some other activities, email information, anything around marketing emails, just so many things that you can set the criteria to create a workflow. So let's say I wanted to create a workflow of, and you can also do things like a list membership. So this is one of the most straightforward ones. So let's say I wanted to set up a workflow that is for all nonprofit leads and is a member of this. Now, if I want to filter that down even further, I could say, and is also a member of, let's say, these are all my lists that I have segment lists set up in HubSpot. Let's say I want it to be current Razor Sync subscribers as well. So now I have a segment, or I have criteria that filters for two different lists. We're really narrowing it down to a certain segment of folks. So then I would save and continue. You're going to find settings like this along the way where you might want to allow contacts to re-enroll. Let's say they came out of the current Razor Sync subscribers list at one point, but then they came back in. Should they be re-enrolled, or do we just want it to happen to them the first time? So you'll come across settings like that. You'll save and continue. And then very similar to what you saw and what I showed in the nonprofit demo, you're going to be configuring different actions. And there's so many different actions that you can do. The workflow can have to do with contacts in your database, or it can have to do with doing something internal, or it could be both, because in this case, if any of these are a segment, I can then do something when someone becomes part of both of these lists. When the contact first meets all of this criteria, I can do something like send an internal email, right? So if I just do a search here, I like to just do a search for everything I need, send internal email notification. So I could just even still make this internal to me, to our organization, and send an email to myself saying this contact just met this criteria for whatever reason that I might want to know that for. So just as an example, I'm going to cancel that out. I can also update their record. So let's say I wanted to, once they become a member of both of these lists, let's say I wanted to fill out a certain property. I want to, let's see, enrich a record. Let's see, I want to increase or decrease the property, or I just want to edit a record. So maybe I want to fill out a certain property. I want the system to go ahead and fill out a certain property in HubSpot based on the fact that they met this criteria. Or perhaps I want to update their life cycle stage, for example. So here's all the things I can change in their contact record. If I did this life cycle, for example, sometimes you just have to look and see what you can do. Let's say I want to replace or clear, I want to replace, and then I want to fill in a certain value. Let's say one of these was, let's say it's customer. That's what I want to do. Once I know they're in this current subscribers, let's make sure they're a customer, even though I know they're already going to be, because that's already part of this process. But just as an example, I can do something inside the platform to update this contacts records. It can be about contacts, but then again, not have anything to do with actually sending them anything or anything like that. But just for the purposes of the marketing operations, I'm going to update their lifecycle stage or change some other property in there. I'm going to pick a different property because I don't actually want to change their life cycle stage. I'm actually not going to do anything with this customer, but just for the sake of showing it in the workflow, I'll say property to change, customer, and then say yes. It's another thing I know is already actually part of an automated process, but just for the sake of showing here. So now I can say save, right? And what you're going to do is you're going to see it's going to edit the record. So still, this is about contacts, but nothing happening to actual, like the contact will actually receive anything or anything like that. I'm just updating the record. So let's just show what logic looks like here for a minute. So let's say I wanted to do a branching object. Branching might not make sense in this workflow, but let's just see if we can figure something out here. Let's try something else. If they are, like, let's say they're also Lifeline client. Let's just make this up as we go here. Let's see. So let's say in their contact property, and I think we have some Lifeline customer is any of, yes. So let's say we want to do that. We'll save that. And so now it's saying, okay, we've set the record to say that this is a Razor Sync customer. What if they're also a Lifeline client? Then what do we want to have happen? At this stage, we may want to send them an email of some sort. So we're going to say send email. We're just going to say send email. So in this case, we're going to send an email to the contact. I could also still just send an internal email, and I can do other things as well. I can send them a survey. So let's just go ahead and I could send them a survey. What's it like being a Lifeline and a Razor Sync customer? And then I would choose my email. I don't actually have an email, but let's just send them like a customer welcome, like that, just for pretend. And then if they're not, then maybe I'll send them another email. I'll send those folks an email that says, let's go back to email, send email. So I'm going to send them something that says, hey, have you heard about our Lifeline program? Like, you welcome as a Razor Sync customer. Have you heard about our Lifeline program? And so then I would send that out as well, even though it's not really the Lifeline welcome packet, but let's say it's a Lifeline promotional email. I would go ahead and send that. So that's how that works. Now you can actually continue doing branches all along. So workflows can get very elaborate. In fact, we've seen workflows that can go on, and we're scrolling our screen almost like a really big giant whiteboard. So another recommendation I have is just like thinking about keeping it simple striking a balance between being efficient and being able to see a workflow working and branching off in ways that really make sense. But then if it starts to become too cumbersome, just step back and make sure that you can't maybe split it off into two workflows as well. And then you can edit behavior between workflows as well. So let's say, for example, this client gets, or this contact gets to the end of sending this email. After the email gets sent, maybe I'm going to put them in another workflow, right? So when they're done with this workflow, I can actually send them over to a different workflow. So that's how you can connect your workflows as well. You can have people follow a certain sequence that makes sense and go from one workflow to another. So with that, let's go back out and I just will show you a few of the examples I talked about earlier, which is the more internal ones. So you can also set up workflows to do things like clean up your contact database. So if you, typically those are more one time. Let's say you brought in an import and you had a property that said that they had a certain subscription type in your old email system, and you want to assign them that subscription type in HubSpot's subscription settings, right? You can't do that automatically by just importing, right? And so you have to have that step in between to say, okay, they subscribed to this newsletter. We have the data in the import to indicate that. So it's in like a custom property. But now we have to take a step further and make sure they go ahead and get subscribed to the right subscription type. So that's another example of how you can use the automation just to save time and work and get it done in one fell swoop instead of doing something manual. And that again can be like a one-time workflow that you can then delete when you're sure that you're done with it. So that's a good example. But sometimes there's things that you're going to do ongoing. And so sometimes you'll do internal or admin things that are ongoing. Like for example, here's one that is when someone has paid for their onboarding. This is pretty simple. As soon as someone actually pays for their onboarding, that's when we send an internal email to me right now, which says that they paid for it, because then we do a personal welcome and we send out a personalized welcome email. And so in this case, we're sending an internal notification because we don't just send a cookie cutter. We could put it in this workflow, but we like to personalize it more. So it sends us a notification, and then we have a template that we can start with, and then we can personalize that template to say, oh, okay, dear so-and-so. Not that we couldn't personalize that in the email with a token, but we get even more personalized where we say, hey, we've already talked about this and this goal that you have with onboarding. We're looking forward to getting going. Here's a link for kicking off and all of that good stuff. It helps with just continuing to keep processes going. It's great for sales teams. It's great for marketing teams to keep marketing going, whether it's internally or whether it is to your contacts. So that is my demo on workflows. I know I could never cover every single thing, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of kind of the different kinds of things that you can do with workflows, and also just my experience and tips from working in HubSpot for over a decade. I'll review some of the ones I already said, which is to keep it well organized and labeled and described in terms of each and every workflow so that you can really track what you've got going on. My other tip to obviously that goes along with labeling them for the different buckets they fall into, just so you are very clear what's actually going out to contacts and what's actually internal. Not that one is more important than the other, but just to make sure visually that you have that on your radar when you're looking at the list of workflows. Also, not to keep one workflow too cumbersome. Not only is that hard to edit, but it can also cause issues later on down the line with marketing. It can break things easily. Don't get too fancy with one workflow. You can certainly use it as is reasonable to create different branches and things like that. But if it's, again, getting a little too complicated, think about using different workflows and think about simplifying the process even maybe. And we also talk in terms of marketing systems and marketing, full funnel marketing systems. So it's also really good to have a plan, like a big picture plan. There may be things that you're already doing that you've got to get going. You're migrating email systems over to HubSpot. You just got to get that going. Maybe you have a donation landing page that you set up and you have a form and, hey, we want to get out a thank you. We want to start using HubSpot to follow up with that donor. Of course, do those things. But if you're starting to think really big and getting mesmerized by the tool and all of the different things that you can do with it, just make sure to step back and see what's the goal of this workflow that I'm thinking about doing. And or what is the plan? What's our strategy? What's our marketing strategy? Because the tool is just a tool to fuel the engine of your marketing. It's not for the tool's sake. So HubSpot is really powerful, but it should be leveraged for a marketing strategy and for a marketing plan that you can automate and that you can also track with tracking and reporting so that you can continue to go back and optimize that plan. So all of that thinking, I believe, should factor into when you're creating workflows, why you're creating workflows, where do they fit into our funnel? Where are they fitting? Does it come together like a puzzle or is it random and scattered? So those are some things to think about when you're approaching the workflow tool. Sometimes we just need something to fix a migration of or import of data or enrich that data and assign certain properties and things like that. Of course, one-time workflows to get stuff done is great always. Obviously, don't have to think too hard for that. But when it comes to it being an ongoing piece of marketing, just make sure that you're thinking about what's the goal of where does it fit in.